Thank you so much. Wow, what a great audience we've got. Thank you again. So, I'd like to introduce you to the purpose of today's meeting, which is to familiarize you with the decision-making tool called Fuzzy Cognitive Mapping, or FCM, in the context of making wildfire decisions among stakeholders, and specifically in Rachel's thesis concerned a group in Waianae, West Oahu. So here's today's flow. We've already done our welcome and how-tos, and we'll do an audience pulse check in a moment. We're also going to be handing it off to Rachel for her presentation, which includes a demo of the Fuzzy Cognitive Mapping tool in action. And we'll do 10 minutes for general questions and open discussions, and we'll conclude at 12. But we're happy to stick around for those of you that have additional questions afterwards. Now for our guest speaker. Rachel Cleveland is a graduate student of UH Manoa's Natural Resource and Environmental Management Department, and she will give us the ins and outs of her decision-making research in Hawaii and how to use the mental modeling tool. And a reminder that the chat box is there for you for questions and comments along the way. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rachel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Bear with me. I am recovering from my COVID booster shot, so I apologize if I cough. I'll try to mute myself. But yeah, I'm just here today to talk about the modeling process of fuzzy cognitive mapping. Next slide, please. So first, just to talk about the background of wildfires in Hawaii. So fires have been increasing in Hawaii in recent years, and most of these fires are human caused, and they can impact the landscape in a variety of different ways. Typically, we see these wildfires in what's known as the grass fire cycle, depicted here. And what that is basically an invasive grass species invades an area, which increases the fuel load of the landscape, which means it's more flammable. And this leads to reoccurring wildfire incidents, which then leads to a loss of native species and a continued invasive species invasion. And so it basically creates this positive feedback loop of wildfires on the landscape. In addition, managing for these fires is complex and costly. There's a variety of different objectives that stakeholders may have, and then fire managers need to make decisions under uncertainty and with limited budgets. On top of that, they can also have limited time and resources to be able to make these decisions. And then finally, it's important to understand that fire impacts the different ecosystem services provided by the landscape. And ecosystem services are just the things that we care about that the landscape provides. And I'll give some examples in a second. But basically, fire managers need quick and easy and cost-effective ways to model and understand how fires impact ecosystem services in order to make management decisions. Next slide. This leads to my first question. How do different fire management alternatives impact these ecosystem services? Because in addition to the impacts that fires have on the landscape, our management actions can also impact the landscape. Next slide. So different ecosystem services that fire impacts can be things like soil nutrient cycling, it can be biodiversity, carbon storage, water quality, and then, like I mentioned, management actions can also impact these effects. Next slide. Fire, pretty much anywhere, but especially in Hawaii, there's a variety of options that fire managers can choose to manage the landscape for fire. They typically fall under three main categories of either suppression, control, or prevention. So these things could take the form of, let's say, emergency response or creating fire breaks, which are gaps in vegetation. It can be a fuels reduction. So this would be like managed grazing or mowing, and then also fuel conversion, which is like native plant restoration or Firewise community practices, such as clearing vegetation from the home. But in addition to thinking about the ecosystem services and also the different management actions we can take, decision makers also need to think about what stakeholders care about. Next slide, please. Which led me to my second question of how do different stakeholder objectives impact our management decisions? Next slide. because involving stakeholders within the decision-making process has a lot of different benefits. And so it can benefit the decision itself because involving stakeholders allows you to see it in a local context and be very site-specific. It can also incorporate specific community needs. It also helps to build trust between the stakeholders that are impacted by the decisions and the decision makers. And then overall, by involving stakeholders in the whole process, it can increase the likelihood for implementation and success. It also benefits the modeling methodology because it allows you to incorporate knowledge from a variety of different sources. It can also reduce uncertainty. And then it can also just incorporate not only from a variety of different sources, but also like a variety of different contexts and like specific knowledge sources too. And then finally, it also benefits the stakeholders by getting them involved in the process. It allows for educational opportunities for the folks to learn more about the specifics of the problem at hand. It can also encourage collaboration between stakeholders. And then it also offers stakeholders an opportunity to express their specific objectives. And so participatory management practices like fuzzy cognitive mapping promote stakeholder collaboration and engagement, which can improve the overall decision-making process. And then basically when stakeholders understand the process and become a part of it, they have a more personal connection to the overall decision and have that personal buy-in. Next slide. So now I want to dig into specifically what is fuzzy cognitive mapping, because we understand the context and why we might want to use fuzzy cognitive mapping to engage with stakeholders, but what is it really? So this is a picture of a fuzzy cognitive map. And essentially what it is it's a concept map that defines different components and relationships within like a system or a context or a problem. The components are things that can either increase or decrease, and they are the things that are important to the system or the concept. These components are then connected through relationships, and these relationships have a direction and then a positive or negative weight. So the direction just tells you what is impacting what. And then a positive relationship means as one thing increases, the other would increase. And then a negative relationship means that as one increases, the other decreases. And then the weight is just how strong is that relationship. It's usually depicted as high, medium, or low. And so the purpose of these maps are to take a person's or a group's knowledge and make it explicit. So we're taking what you know, and then we're writing it down and documenting it in a meaningful way. Next slide. So there's 3 key steps to making a fuzzy cognitive map. First, we need to determine the important components of a system or concept or problem. Then we need to define the relationships between those components. And then finally, what you can do is run what if scenarios to see how our system might react to different changes to that system. So within the context of wildfire management, we would then input our management actions or our possible management actions to see how they would impact the system. Next slide. And so there's a lot of benefits to fuzzy cognitive mapping. First, it's pretty simple and easy to use and understand. It also incorporates stakeholders throughout the process, which has the benefits that I talked about earlier. It's also very context specific because you build it together as a group or as an individual specific for the problem at hand. It can also capture knowledge from a lot of different sources because if you're doing it in like a workshop setting, you can get knowledge from a variety of different folks with their own unique knowledge and experience. It's also transparent and defensible because it has specific steps that you follow that I just talked about. And so this allows for the decisions that you make to be, other people can follow your logic and how you did it. And then finally, it can also be incorporated into any decision-making framework. So you can use fuzzy cognitive mapping on its own or in conjunction with any other decision-making tools in your toolkit, which makes it really just useful and flexible. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to demonstrate the fuzzy cognitive mapping process through the system that's free and just accessible online, known as Mental Modeler. And I've chosen the question of we can either graze to create fuel breaks or do native species outplanting for fire prevention? Which is best if we are concerned about water quality? So if it's all right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and can I just get a thumbs up that we can see it? Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is Mental Modeler. Like I said, you just access it online. And this is how you can build a fuzzy cognitive map. So just for time's sake, I had already added the components that I was going to use for this demonstration. But just so you folks are aware, all you have to do is add a component, type in a name, and then there you have it. Okay, so we've got these components here, and then what I can do is start creating relationships. And so let's start with erosion. I'm just going to drag my arrow over here and think about, okay, how does erosion impact water quality? Well, from my knowledge, I know that as erosion increases, it can have a pretty strong negative impact on water quality. So I chose this negative relationship, and I gave it a really strong weight, this -1. But this scroller bar here just I can change how strong that relationship is. Okay, great. And so then I think, okay, how does water quality impact fishing? Well, I know that as water quality increases, so does the fishing because the fish are happy. Let's do another one. I think, I know that wildfires can really strongly increase erosion. So I think wildfires would have a positive relationship, a strong positive relationship with erosion. And let's see, I think generally speaking, wildfires can have a pretty strong negative relationship with native species. So again, meaning that as wildfires increase, native species decrease. And then sometimes I think that maybe native species has a strong positive benefit to water quality, just as an example. And then maybe native species can also have maybe a low positive impact on fishing. And so now that we have our map created of the system, we can then think about the different actions that we want to take and how that could impact the system. So right here, like I mentioned, we have grazing, and then we also have native species outplanting. So I think that native species outplanting is going to have a strong negative relationship to wildfires because as we plant more native species, that's going to cause wildfires to decrease. It's also going to have a strong positive benefit to native species because as you plant native species, there will be more native species. And then finally with grazing, I think that with wildfires, it will again have a negative relationship because it's going to cause the wildfires to decrease. And then there might also be a small relationship to erosion, maybe as grazing increases, erosion might increase a little bit too. So now I just want to go over the different tabs here within the mental modeler framework. So first, this is pretty simple. It's just an info tab. You can write, who made the model, give it a name, and then describe it as well. Here is a matrix side. We don't really need to worry about that too much. All this does is it's a different way of displaying this information here on the model side. So that's not really something that you would necessarily need to worry about or think about. And then this other one is also pretty jargony and mostly used kind of in a research context of how to compare different models, and it has some different ways of describing the fuzzy cognitive map, but there's not really anything that you need to worry about here, except you might want to look at this section right here, the preferred state, because you can, for each component, say whether or not you'd want it to increase or decrease. So you could change that here if you'd like, but you don't have to. It can be helpful when you've got a pretty complex map, but for one that is this small, it's really not too necessary. And so then where the power really comes from is this scenario builders tab right here. And so what I can do is, having inputted these two actions, I can then compare them to see how they impact the system and help me make my decision. So right here, a mental modeler starts off with one scenario already here, and then we can press this add button to create a different scenario. So for the first one, I'm going to have it be grazing. And then for the second one, I will have it be planting. And so for this grazing one, what I'm going to do to be able to compare the two actions is I'm going to maximize grazing here. And what this is going to do is going to create a small graph that explains the impact to the system. So it's going to give out these numbers, and just note that they're unitless. They have no real value. It's just a way to compare effects to each other. So for example, I can see that this is 0.02 and this is 0.02, so they're about equal. But it's not any actual value that you would want to use for anything, but it's just a means to compare. So by maximizing grazing, I can see that we get a strong decrease in wildfires, a small increase in erosion, and a small increase in native species. And then when I go over here to planting, so in this scenario, we're going to maximize native species outplanting and see how that impacts. So we get the same negative or same decrease in wildfires as we did with grazing. And then we also get a small decrease in erosion, increase in water quality, a really strong increase in native species, and a small increase in fishing. And so in creating all of this, what we can see is that if we're thinking specifically about water quality, our best management action might be to do native species outplanting over grazing. Another cool thing about these scenarios is that you can also use it to tweak your model. So if you get a result that you think is like, oh, that's weird, I wouldn't expect that to be true, you can also kind of use it to fine tune the model itself. So as you can see here, maybe I think that, a decrease in erosion, oh, that's kind of odd, or maybe I think in grazing, oh, the erosion is increasing, that's a little strange. Maybe in my experience, grazing doesn't increase erosion. So I can go back to the model and say, oh, yeah, maybe this relationship isn't so accurate. I can delete it, and then the scenario can change. And so then, as you can see with grazing, the erosion is now decreasing, and so now we're seeing an increase in water quality. And so, yeah, so that's basically how you could use Mental Modeler to create a fuzzy cognitive map. And again, it really is, the point of it is to be able to compare those what if scenarios to help guide your management action. And then just a couple of other things, up here, you can create a new model right here. This is how you load in an existing model. You can save it to your computer as well. And then some of these other ones can help you export it in different ways. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can go back to the presentation. And I will talk about how I use this fuzzy cognitive mapping to benefit some folks in Waianae. All right, so we can go ahead and go to the next slide when you're ready. Okay, great. Okay, so for my research, what I did was I co-developed a project with a local wildfire coalition called the Waianae Wildfire Hui. They began in early 2020 and have a diverse set of group members. The members are mostly nonprofit leaders, farmers, landowners, foresters, biologists, educators, and all sorts of other related stakeholders. They meet monthly to discuss relevant fire management information, share ideas, and collaborate together on all aspects of fire mitigation and preparedness. Many of the members are landowners in Waianae, and in recent years, they have faced numerous wildfires on their lands, and they want to change that. So like many land managers, the costs and complexities of wildfire management are a limiting factor. So rather than working alone, they came together to tackle the problem as one. They've been guided by the nonprofit Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, and with some grant money, the group was ready to decide what they could do to help prevent wildfires from occurring on their properties over the coming months. And then I just have a quote from the group here. Our immediate goal is to reduce fire risk. Our long-term goal is to improve fire management within the Waianae watershed. Next slide, please. So for those who aren't familiar, here's a map of the Waianae watershed. It's on the west side of the island of Oahu, and it's typically hot and dry at lower elevations with cooler and wetter conditions in the mountain ranges above. Due to human activity, up to 96% of the landscape is now dominated by non-native species, and native species are now typically only found at the higher elevations. Agricultural productivity is high in Waianae, and both traditional and Western agriculture have long histories in the region, with land use in agriculture being about 40%. And then according to the 2020 US Census, about 52,000 people live here today. Next slide. So the problem that these folks were facing is, wildfires are increasing, so what can we do to prevent them? So what I first did is I wanted to understand what did folks care about in terms of what the landscape was providing to them, also known as those ecosystem services. And in interviewing folks, I found that the top 3 concerns were biodiversity, spiritual experience, and water resources. And so then we also had to think about, well, what are our options for wildfire prevention? And in speaking with folks again, the top 3 that were mentioned was herbicide use, native species outplanting, and grazing. And so what I did was I created a fuzzy cognitive map for each of those concerns, the biodiversity, spiritual experience, and water resources. And then for each of them, I compared how herbicide use, native species outplanting, and grazing would impact each of those concerns. Next slide, please. So this is no worries that you can't read this. You shouldn't be able to. It's very complex. I'm just showing you the 3 maps that we created just to demonstrate how complex these maps can become and just to show you what as a group we were able to create. And so this is the biodiversity map. If you go to the next slide, please, that will show the spiritual experience map. And then the next slide will be the water resources map. And so as you can see, especially when dealing with a complex problem like wildfire management, intuition isn't always enough. And so mapping it out like this can help us see connections and relationships that we wouldn't ordinarily see, and also ensures that we consider every aspect of the situation. And then finally, by doing it in this formal process, we help make transparent and defensible decisions. And so next slide. So taking all of those 3 fuzzy cognitive maps, these were kind of the ultimate results that we came to as a group. And so for the biodiversity map, native species outplanting had the highest impact, positive impact on biodiversity. Herbicide use had a smaller positive impact, and then grazing didn't have an impact. For the spiritual experience, native species outplanting, again, also had the strongest positive impact, and then herbicide use and grazing had no significant impact. And then finally, for the water resources map, native species outplanting, again, was found to have the highest positive impact, with grazing have a smaller but still positive impact, and then herbicide use had a negative impact. And so just as an aside, fuzzy cognitive mapping is site and context specific. So these results are unique to this community and the folks that came together to create these maps through the workshops. But the process that I just showed you through the mental modeler system can be applied to any wildfire management problem in Hawaii and beyond, and even other natural resource problems, so long as there are willing participants to take part in the process. And then the more participation, the better, because you can capture those diverse knowledge sources. And then finally, you would want to include fuzzy cognitive mapping typically within another decision-making framework, because there are other things to consider with management actions, such as like cost or maybe public opinion. And so you would possibly need to incorporate those things as well. But at least for the landscape impacts, the fuzzy cognitive mapping can capture all of that. Next slide, please. So I just want to give a big mahalo nui loa to my thesis committee, as well as the folks from HWMO who helped me create this project and supported me. And then, of course, a big mahalo to the Waianae Wildfire Hui for allowing me to be a part of their group and allowing me to conduct this research with them. Next slide. And so with that, depending on time, we can either do some guiding questions in small breakout rooms, or we can also just do excuse me, a Q&A with myself if folks have any questions about the fuzzy cognitive mapping process or my research or anything else really. But yeah, thank you all for coming. And I hope that this has inspired you to check out this process and see if it would be something that would be useful within your own work.
Thank you, Rachel, for that really excellent and I think thought-provoking presentation about how we can make our decision-making process more intentional and structured. I particularly like how FCM makes explicit our values and resources as stakeholders and the specific relationships between them. And then how more or less of something can affect outcomes, or at least the perception of them. And I actually have a question about that in a bit. But I do think that this is a way to really engage stakeholders in a thoughtful discussion that specifies how different actions have different outcomes. So with that, I think what I'd like to do is to invite all of you to turn your videos on if you don't mind, and unmute yourself, and then we can open it up for discussions. And the questions we have are listed right here, and Elizabeth will paste those in the chat for you so we can stop sharing slides. But what does this inspire? How might you use it? And then how might you implement it in your day and life work? And if you feel more comfortable using the chat box, then feel free to type your answers there. But we definitely would like to hear from a few of you about your thoughts and reactions to Rachel's presentation. I'd like to actually start first with a question, Rachel. It's interesting to me, that you're outlining people's perceptions, and then maybe that's an important thing to clarify here, which is these are not necessarily actually stated facts in concrete. For example, like that herbicides and negatively impact water quality. This is really a tool to outline people's perceptions of what concerns might be. Is that right? Maybe you can clarify that.
Yeah. So it actually could be used in both ways. You could use it as more of a perception tool, and that's when really engaging the stakeholders is going to come into play. So it would be a lot of like, okay, how do stakeholders view the problem? You could also use it in a more concrete way if you were using specifically experts or only experts in the creation of the map. So like, for example, here, if I had like a firefighter and a biologist and a hydrologist coming together to make the map, then it could maybe be considered more factual and not just perception based. So it kind of depends. You could use it both ways though. It depends on your needs and your resources really.
Great.
Rachel, I don't know if you see the chat, but there are a few questions.
Yeah.
The first question was from Shelley, and she asked if this methodology has been used anywhere else in Hawaii.
Yeah, I don't think so. When I was doing my background research and investigating, while FCM has been used for other natural resource problems, nothing that I came across was used specifically in Hawaii.
Okay, well, the next question we have was, how did herbicide help biodiversity in the biodiversity map you made?
Yeah, so this one, that's kind of a perfect example of how it can be factual versus perception, and kind of can be influenced by how the folks interpret the question. And so in this case, with that workshop, the folks kind of talked through this and had decided, well, with very intentional and specific herbicide use application, it could actually help biodiversity if it was very targeted to the invasive species. So that's how they overall interpreted the relationship, and that's how I documented it in this group or from my research. But it is true, that was with speaking with biologists who used herbicide use regularly versus maybe the general public perception would think of it in a more negative light. So that also kind of gets into how the fuzzy cognitive mapping can be very like site and context specific too, because herbicide use can have negative impacts when closer to water resources, for example. So for that specific situation, they were thinking of it along the lines of very targeted and specific herbicide use.
Thank you, Rachel. So Elliot has a question about the parameter values, really maybe having a big impact on the outcome of the models. So I don't know, Elliot, if you want to talk anything more about that or explain your question more, but his question in the chat was if you have any thoughts on how to estimate the parameters.
Yeah, Elliot, would you mind describing the question? I don't quite understand what you mean by the parameters.
Sure. Thanks, and good to see everybody. So when it wasn't just a matter of choosing a plus or a minus, but you had a range of values, and so the values were, I believe, representative of the strength of the relationship. And so the question is, how do you determine that number that you choose? And it looked like in your example, you went, mostly you chose either the -1 or the +1, but it looked like there were a lot of different options. And so estimating the strength of those relationships, it seems like might be important.
Yeah, for sure. So typically with fuzzy cognitive mapping, what's used is a high, medium, or low. And depending on the specific research paper, they would oftentimes, a high would be represented as a positive or -1. And then a low would be like a 0.33 positive or negative. And then typically a medium would be like a 0.66 positive or negative. And that's kind of how you would capture that high, medium, or low. During my demonstration, yes, I kind of just eyeballed it, but what you can do within Mental Modeler, especially in that matrix stage, is you can type it in specifically. So you can change for it to capture those more specific, like high, medium, or low, whatever you deem that number to be. I believe what's most important is just being consistent throughout the map as what is high, what is medium, and what is low.
Quick follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
So is the point then that the strength of the relationships are based on people's perceptions? So right, so we're not trying to assess reality. We're just trying to assess the strength of the relationships based on people's kind of values and belief systems.
Exactly. Yep. So again, this would be if you were dealing with like primarily stakeholders, then yes, it'd be completely perception based in what people think or have gained through their years of experience. This is what I've seen and this is what I know it to be. It can be more factual based using experts, so someone who's been involved in a situation for 20 years, and they have a lot of knowledge and they can demonstrate that. Or again, like a researcher at a university might come in and, oh, I have this expertise, so I'm going to display it that way. So that's how fuzzy cognitive mapping can actually be very useful when there's a lack of empirical data. Instead, you can kind of take an expert and have them come in and say, oh, this is what I know to be true. But yes, it does lean more towards the perception based rather than factual. And that's also why when you're looking at those scenarios, you're not taking the values and using them. They don't have a unit. It's really just to compare scenarios within that specific context that you've created through the model.
And Rachel, there's a little buzz in the chat about, is that where the word fuzzy comes into play?
Yes, that's why it's fuzzy. My understanding, and I'm not an expert, but the fuzzy has to do with the high, medium, low, rather than having like a binary of ones and zeros or something along those lines.
And it might actually provide a map for exploring those questions empirically, right? I mean, it might be like, well, someone takes issue with the perception, let's just say, of native species not causing wildfire. Well, is that really true? And then you can go in and perhaps do a research project based on some of the perceptions that are created from outlining them.
For sure.
All right, does anyone else have any questions? There are some comments in the chat for those who can't see it about this being a pretty cool online tool, because there's other, online things for mental mapping, but this is a new one to some folks. And there was another comment about it's just nice to have another tool that can help explore how potential factors and actions can relate to each other. And then Clay just asked if you had any cases where the group identified new actions or strategies through this mental mapping process.
Yeah, let me think about that, I think the biggest thing was for this group, they had been working together for quite some time. And so I think in doing the workshops, it really was a great facilitation tool to kind of talk together, especially because, like I mentioned, the group does come from a variety of different folks with different backgrounds. And so it got people who are maybe more social science based to talk to people who are more like biologist based. And so I think it was really a great facilitation tool. There was some discrepancies on the herbicide use. Some were really for it, some were really against it. So it caused them to kind of come together and talk about that, and whether or not the impacts are really as negative as they seem to be, and things like that. I think it also, I'm trying to remember, if I look back at the map, there were some connections that were unique, like thinking about monoculture versus traditional Hawaiian agriculture and how those pieces were distinct in the overall framework for water quality. That was another interesting thing that people like to talk about. In terms of like new management strategies, I would say people were pretty focused on the ones that came up during the interviews. And so we didn't really explore new management strategies, but I could imagine that fuzzy cognitive mapping, especially in a new group where maybe folks hadn't already had this history of working together, I'd imagine it could facilitate just kind of management strategy generation as well.
And Rachel, I have a follow-up question to that, because well, for those in the group who may not know, it's actually our organization who facilitates this group every month. And I'm interested because you had mentioned, some were more, biophysical science, some were more social science, but just to be clear, this group has no scientists except maybe Clay. And so you were saying what their perspectives were lending in one direction or another, when you're thinking about it from a science perspective. But my question to you is, knowing that it's farmers and teachers and community members, at even, Hawaiian Electric and others, there's a whole diversity of folks who come together every month. What did you get that in terms of their openness and their receptivity to being scienced, to being incorporated in a scientific sort of process, and to be, now even being classified as more research, more social or more biophysical science. These are not scientists. And so they went through this process with you and have been utilizing it in their project planning and in their understanding of each other and the situation. So I'm just interested for you to learn from you about how open they were, how receptive they were, how participatory they were, because that the science piece and you doing research is totally outside the scope of what the group joined for.
Right. Yeah, no, they were awesome. They really enjoyed learning about the process. And I think that's kind of where engaging the stakeholders allows for educational opportunities for them as well. And yeah, they were totally open and receptive and were very curious about the system. And I think it also just kind of good. They were happy and proud that they were able to share their knowledge in a more defined way. And I think that kind of just goes to show the power of engaging stakeholders, because the knowledge of someone who's been farming for 40 years isn't going to necessarily be captured in the literature and in traditional science. And so I think it's really interesting how this fuzzy cognitive mapping can capture knowledge that's totally valuable, totally valid and accurate, but then documents it in a more transparent and defensible way, and kind of just just allows it to be used because it is valuable information. But yeah, in terms of folks having not come from a scientific background, at least in terms of the feedback that I got, they thought that it was easy to partake, and they were happy to share their knowledge in a way that could be used in a research setting.
And Elliot followed up on that, just asking about if there were any arguments or conflicts within the group in determining the plus or minus or the strength of the relationships in your maps.
Yeah, so there were certainly discussions, and there were definitely within the workshops, and that was kind of the point, right, to have these folks come together. And so oftentimes we would kind of compromise, if someone thinks it's really strong one way and maybe they're like, oh no, I think it's low, then we could kind of come together and say, oh, then maybe it's a medium impact, things like that. But I will say, I think this group is very unique in that it had already been operating for over a year by the time I had come in. And so folks were used to communicating with each other and got along well. And so overall, there was a pretty low level of conflict. It was mostly just kind of discussions, and folks were pretty good about compromising and finding that common ground to kind of compromise and decide what those relationships would be and like what their weight was. And what was really great in having multiple people in the workshop setting, they could be like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. Yeah, I see your point of view and why you say this relationship is this way, and I actually agree with you, so there was certainly a lot of discussion, but there wasn't really any issue in terms of conflict where people couldn't get to a point where they agreed with what we ended up putting on the map.
And what's your take, and this is from the chat as well, on whether the map would actually change management actions as compared to using our gut feelings or practical experience about the effectiveness of various strategies?
Yeah, so in terms of changing, I'm honestly, I think it can change. I think especially if you involve the stakeholders, I think that's where it can be really powerful. I think maybe if it doesn't necessarily change the management action you decide, it can certainly change the public perception and the stakeholder perception of that management action. I do know just from the feedback of the folks that I worked with, they were really happy to be involved with the process and be able to kind of see it get documented out in this very visual way. And then in terms of changing management action, it does again depend on if we're going based off of perceptions versus maybe expert opinion, because obviously perceptions are, if you're creating a map just based on perceptions, then kind of your gut feeling is probably going to be the same when you start looking at the scenarios specifically. But I do think that where its power lies is really in getting stakeholders involved in the process as a whole, as well as getting folks to collaborate and communicate with each other as they're kind of going through this process to understand what the best course of action is.
Thank you, Rachel. And I want to follow up on Andrea Gill's question about, for instance, some of the management activities that are chosen are done because the managers on the ground don't need to be convinced of the need to reduce fires or plant more natives, et cetera. But the process itself, do you think that it allows others to see what went into deciding those management actions as well?
Yeah, I do think so. Again, with that whole defensible and transparent aspect, it really allows you to go through this decision in a specific way, following this specific framework. And so it kind of gives some merit to what you're doing, or merit to that gut feeling. You can kind of say, this is what I think is true, document it out, get input from other folks, and then be able to say, oh yeah, that's, it can kind of reaffirm what you already thought was true. And then it allows it, it creates this visual that you can then share with other folks, and like you can see, and they can see for themselves just how things are working and how what you think to be true is working in this particular way. So I think that it can definitely be beneficial in that aspect, even if it is kind of based on gut feelings that might not completely change the ultimate decision.
So I'm aware of the time, and some people have already had to leave. So I just wanted to say, some folks have commented that they're interested in seeing this kind of process take place in their areas. And also there's a question from Wendy that says, reflecting on all the things explored during this research initiative, what were your big takeaways from this project?
Yeah, I think the key takeaways were, again, I was able to see just how valuable it was to get folks involved in the overall process. And I was able to see how having the visuals there and having it be in a demonstrable way, being able to see how these things were created and how everything fit together. I think that was incredibly valuable. And again, it was also adding this collaboration aspect. And then, yeah, I guess the other key takeaway that really stood out to me is how often the folks from the fire hui, just how much pride they had for the work that they were doing. And so the ability for them to take part in something that was documented and then can be shared to help other groups, I think, again, like I had mentioned, it really creates that buy-in. You know, they really care about the overall process and the ultimate management success, you know, when they are able to have their own voices be heard and their own opinions and show that yes, it matters and yes, it will impact what we end up doing. I think that was incredibly valuable.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rachel, for presenting today, and everybody for your participation and your questions. I think Melissa has a final wrap up for us, and then we'll, all move on with our days. But thank you to Rachel and Melissa for organizing this for all of us, and for all of you for signing up and staying with us. And then Melissa, if you want to close us out.
Sure. I'm not going to struggle with the share slide again. I'm just going to ask you folks to please email us if you have any other questions. And before you log on or log off, we need your feedback on a survey, if you don't mind. It helps us document what we're doing. It'll take 30 seconds. Give us your honest feedback about what you liked, what you didn't like, and that'll help tailor us for the next go around. And again, if you come up with any additional questions or you'd like to see this presentation again, maybe we will have this recorded for you on our PFX website. So we'll send that link to you afterwards, as well as a link to all of our resources. So with that, thank you again, Rachel. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. This was really helpful for me. I'll just say one last thing, that what Franny was saying, it was the first question to Rachel, which was like, is this really going to change what resources managers do? And what I've come to understand is that it's really an engagement facilitation process that helps validate what everyone is feeling, therefore mental mapping, as opposed to, on the applied science, or rather on the empirical side. And that's super helpful. And it's a really interesting tool that, that never existed when I was doing stewardship work. So thanks again, Rachel, for presenting the value of this, and for all of you for tuning in.